Aside from having different functions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system also contain structural differences. In this learning objective, we'll compare the structural differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic motor neurons. So in both divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the motor pathway contains two motor neurons. The first motor neuron is called a preganglionic neuron. Its cell body is located in the brain or spinal cord, and its axon exits the central nervous system as part of a cranial nerve or a spinal nerve. The axon of a preganglionic neuron is myelinated and usually extends to an autonomic ganglion where it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. The second neuron in an autonomic motor pathway is called the postganglionic neuron. This is because it is post or comes after the ganglion. The postganglionic neuron lies entirely outside of the central nervous system in our peripheral nervous system. Its cell body and dendrites are located in the ganglion. And the axon is an unmyelinated nerve fibre that extends to an effector. So in an autonomic motor pathway, the preganglionic neuron conveys nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the autonomic ganglia, and postganglionic neurons relay nerve impulses from the autonomic ganglia to the effectors. So taking a look at this image, we have our preganglionic neuron here. So going from the spinal cord or the brainstem to our ganglion. It's a myelinated nerve fibre. Here we have our postganglionic neuron extending from our ganglion to our effectors, and this is an unmyelinated nerve fibre. Now taking a look at some of the structural differences and starting with the sympathetic division, and the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system have their cell bodies in the lateral horns of the grey matter in the 12 thoracic and first two lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So this is these cell bodies along here. The ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system, which remember is where our pre and our postganglionic neurons will synapse, are located either in our sympathetic trunk ganglia, which is also called our vertebral chain ganglia because it lies all in a row on either side of the vertebral column, or the prevertebral ganglia, which lie anterior to or in front of the vertebral column. So our sympathetic trunk ganglia are these ones that run all the way from the base of the skull right down to the coccyx on either side. Our prevertebral ganglia are these ganglia here. Now, the postganglionic axons that extend from the sympathetic trunk ganglia primarily innervate organs above the diaphragm, so organs in the head, the neck, the shoulders, and the heart. The postganglionic axons that extend from the prevertebral ganglia tend to innervate organs below the diaphragm, so all of these down here. Now, because our sympathetic trunk and our prevertebral ganglia sit quite close to the spinal cord, most of our sympathetic preganglionic neurons are quite short, and most of our sympathetic postganglionic neurons or axons are quite long. So you can see that first preganglionic neuron here, quite short, because the ganglion sits nice and close to the vertebral column, but then we have the long postganglionic neuron extending all the way to our effector is much longer. Now, once the axons of our sympathetic preganglionic neurons reach the sympathetic trunk ganglia, they can synapse with a postganglionic neuron in a number of ways. So an axon can synapse with a postganglionic neuron in the first ganglion that it reaches. So for example, it comes straight out of our spinal cord and synapses with the first ganglion it reaches. The axon may ascend or descend to either a higher or lower ganglion before synapsing with a postganglionic neuron. So again, we might go through that spinal nerve and then either up or down to a lower ganglion. The axons of the preganglionic neurons that either go up or down form what we call the sympathetic chain. And so that's this part here that kind of connects all of those sympathetic trunk ganglia. An axon can then continue without synapsing through the sympathetic trunk ganglion and end at a prevertebral ganglion and synapse with the postganglionic neuron there. So for example, coming out of the spinal cord through the sympathetic trunk ganglia now to our prevertebral ganglion. An axon may also pass without synapsing through both the sympathetic trunk ganglion and a prevertebral ganglion and then extend to the chromaffin cells of our adrenal medulla, which remember is this endocrine gland which sits on top of the kidneys. So here we're going out the spinal nerve, through our sympathetic trunk ganglia, through our prevertebral ganglia to our chromaffin cells. Now, the reason why a preganglionic neuron can take one of many pathways to meet the postganglionic neuron is because a single sympathetic preganglionic neuron has many axon collaterals, which are just like axon branches, that can synapse with 20 or more postganglionic neurons. So one sympathetic preganglionic neuron can synapse with 20 or more postganglionic neurons. Now, this pattern of projection is what we call divergence, and it helps explain why many of our sympathetic responses affect almost the entire body simultaneously. So think about when you're really nervous, perhaps you have a presentation you have to give in class, your heart races, you feel sick in the stomach, and you begin to sweat. Your whole body is feeling those nerves. Now looking at the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and the cell bodies of our parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are located either in the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves in the brainstem, or in the lateral grey horn of the grey matter in the 2nd to 4th sacral segments of the spinal cord. So up in the nuclei in the brainstem up here, or down in the spinal cord right at the bottom. The autonomic ganglia of the parasympathetic division are called terminal ganglia. And instead of being nice and close to the spinal cord, these are actually either close to or within the wall of a visceral organ. So they sit further out or quite close to the organs themselves. Now, because the terminal ganglia are located either close to or in the wall of a visceral organ, our parasympathetic preganglionic axons are long, while our parasympathetic postganglionic axons are short. So we have these long preganglionic neurons and quite short postganglionic neurons. Now, the axons of our preganglionic neurons pass directly to the terminal ganglia, either near or within that visceral effector. In the ganglia, the presynaptic neuron usually only synapses with up to 4 or 5 postsynaptic neurons, all of which will supply a single visceral effector. So this is what allows our parasympathetic responses to be much more localized than our sympathetic responses. Now, I know that that was a lot of information and a lot of me talking, but most of that information that I just gave you can be summarized into a table like this. Now, the only thing that this table doesn't describe is how one sympathetic preganglionic neuron can synapse with many postsynaptic neurons, which is why we experience the effect of the sympathetic nervous system more widely, but that one parasympathetic preganglionic neuron synapses with far fewer postganglionic neurons, which is why our parasympathetic effects are more localized. But taking a look at our table, we have our sympathetic division. The cell bodies of those preganglionic neurons are located in the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord, so remember these parts here. The ganglia are found close to the spinal cord, so either in this sympathetic trunk ganglia or along here, or our prevertebral ganglia, which sits anterior to the spinal cord. Because of the location of the ganglia, we have short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. If we take a look at our parasympathetic division, these fibers originate in the brain and the sacral spinal cord. So the nuclei in those cranial nerves up here in the brainstem, and then also in the sacral spinal cord. The ganglia are located either close to or actually within the walls of the effector. So you can see some of those here. You can see the rest actually within these organs. For that reason, we have long preganglionic nerve fibers and short postganglionic nerve fibers.